Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything. Welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Today, we continue our study of the New Testament with Matthew chapter 2. My name is Kristen Schmucker, and as a reminder, I am using the free Behold reading plan and the Behold study guide from the Daily Grace Co. And I will link those for you in the show notes. This chapter details the account of the wise men that followed a star to come worship the young Jesus. In this chapter, we see a variety of responses to Jesus, and through it all, we behold Jesus, who is worthy of worship and adoration. The wise men were likely Gentile philosophers or astronomers who arrived in Israel sometime after the birth of Jesus. They had made a long journey, which means they probably did not show up to the manger as depicted in nativity sets at Christmas time. The Magi came to Jerusalem to ask King Herod I where they could find the newborn king, and Herod did not respond well to this news. Herod I was the king of Judea under the Roman Empire, and sadly, his actions in response to the news of Jesus' birth is fitting with the rest of his reign and what we see in history about him. This is a man who killed several of his own sons and even his wife because of how paranoid he was about losing his power. Interestingly, Herod consulted with the religious leaders about where the Messiah would be born. The religious leaders who had studied the Hebrew scripture knew where to point him. The prophecy of Micah 5:2 had generations before declared that the Messiah would be born in the lowly town of Bethlehem. Jesus had left heaven's glory to come to dwell among us. He humbled himself and became a man. He was born of a lowly young woman in lowly and seemingly insignificant town. While Herod was surrounded by the most influential leaders, Jesus, the King of the universe, was held in the arms of a young woman. The Magi did not play into Herod's attempts to manipulate them, but were led by the star to the young Jesus where they worshipped him. They brought him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Church tradition tells us that these gifts were symbolic for the life of Christ. Gold because he is a king, frankincense because he is priest and this spice was used in worship, and myrrh, a common ointment used for burial because his destination was not the manger but the cross. Just as in chapter 1, Joseph receives the message of the Lord and immediately obeys and takes Mary and Jesus to Egypt to escape Herod. Matthew fills his gospel with Old Testament references. The end of verse 15 is a quote from Hosea 11:1. "Out of Egypt I called my son." It is noteworthy for us because it refers in Hosea to the people of Israel. We see here that Jesus is the true Israel who did what Israel could never do by perfectly keeping the law and obeying the Father. As we study the New Testament, we will see many references back to the Old, and we will learn that all of Scripture points us to Christ. In many ways, we will see that the New Testament writers will make connections that even the Old Testament writers did not make. This is often referred to as sensus plenior, which means the fuller sense in Latin. The New Testament provides for us a fuller sense of the Old Testament as it reveals for us how all of Scripture is about Jesus. Another example of this is seen in verse 18. Herod's paranoia and depravity are demonstrated even further as he demands the killing of all baby boys 2 years and under in and around Bethlehem. So often, sin hurts whoever is in its path. But when Matthew quotes from Jeremiah 31 in verse 18, "The weeping is for those who would die in exile," but the rest of the chapter promises a new covenant and the restoration and hope that was to come after the pain of the exile. Matthew quotes this here as a reminder for us that Jesus is the one who will fulfill every promise and transform the weeping of sorrow into the joy of salvation. We see in this passage the response of many people to Jesus. Herod responds with anger, paranoia, fear, and pride. The religious leaders recognize the sign and details of the promised Messiah, but show no response. The Magi respond with joy, worship, and obedience to the young king. Mary and Joseph respond in obedience to the task given to them by God to nurture and raise the one who will be the shepherd to his people. Despite Herod's diabolical plans, the sovereign plan of God would not be stopped. In fact, Satan's fate was just as sealed when these first chapters of Matthew were written as when the final words of the book of Revelation were penned. Though we have a while before we get to those final words, we can live in the assurance that Jesus has won the victory that defeats all of the enemy's plans. As we think about how we can behold Jesus in today's reading, we're reminded to trust in God's sovereign plan for all of creation and our own lives as well. We're prompted to reflect on what our response is to Jesus. And we stand in awe of this young baby who came in humility, who is prophet, priest, and king. He is the true Israel. He is the shepherd of his people. And he is the fulfillment of every promise that God ever gave. As we go into our day, may the response of our hearts be joy, worship, and obedience.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.